The largest country on Earth contains a region so vast it could swallow the continental United States twice over, and the official story of how it got its name is that nobody is entirely sure. Historians will tell you Siberia may derive from a Tatar word meaning sleeping land, or possibly from a Mongol word for pure, or perhaps from the name of an obscure Siberian Khanate that no longer exists and left almost no records. The etymology, depending on which academic source you consult, is uncertain, contested, unresolved. This is unusual. Names for places of this size are not usually uncertain. When a civilization encounters a landmass the size of a continent and decides to start calling it something, the decision tends to leave a trail. There are records of the discussion, or records of who first used the term, or at minimum a clear point of origin from which the name spread outward into common usage. The name finds its source. That is what names do. Siberia does not have a clean source. What it has is a sudden presence in the European cartographic record beginning in the late 16th century, coinciding almost exactly with the period during which the maps of the same region were quietly ceasing to use a different name. A name that those same maps had been using in elaborate detail for the better part of 2 centuries before. That name was Tartaria. And before you reach for the familiar dismissal, consider what you are actually dismissing. You are dismissing the cartographic consensus of the 16th and 17th centuries. You are dismissing the maps held in the British Library, in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, in the Biblioteca Nazionale Marciana in Venice. You are dismissing documents produced by some of the most technically sophisticated cartographic institutions in European history, institutions whose maps of coastlines, river systems, and mountain ranges were accurate enough to navigate by, accurate enough that they were used as military and commercial instruments, accurate enough that errors in them had measurable political and economic consequences. These institutions drew Tartaria. They labeled it. They subdivided it. They placed cities inside it and named them. They drew the roads between those cities and indicated the travel times. They did this with the same methodology they used to draw France and Portugal and the Ottoman Empire. And nobody suggests that France and Portugal and the Ottoman Empire were cartographic confusions dressed up as geography. What happened to Tartaria on the maps is not gradual. This is the thing that the standard historical account, where a standard historical account exists at all, consistently fails to grapple with. Civilizations do not vanish from maps the way Tartaria vanished from maps. They contract. They get absorbed into larger political entities, and the new name appears alongside the old one for a generation or two before the old one fades. There is a period of overlap, of contested terminology, of cartographers disagreeing about what to call a thing that is in transition. The record of a civilization's end is a messy record. Borders blur, names proliferate. The map becomes, for a time, an argument rather than a description. The Tartaria maps do not argue. After a specific window in the late 17th and early 18th century, they simply stop. The name stops appearing. The subdivisions stop appearing. The cities that were labeled within Tartaria stop being labeled as Tartarian and either receive new names or lose their labels entirely. And the geographic area that those maps had spent 200 years documenting as a coherent, organized, named political and cultural entity becomes, on the new maps, something else entirely. It becomes undifferentiated territory. It becomes a region rather than a civilization. It becomes, eventually, Siberia. The word Siberia begins its cartographic life not as a replacement for Tartaria, but as a label for a small area within what the older maps called Tartaria. A Khanate, a district, a subdivision of something larger. This is documented. The early uses of the term are localized, specific, modest in their geographic ambition. And then, in a movement that the historical record does not adequately explain, that localized term expands. It grows. It absorbs the territory that surrounded it. It becomes, within roughly a century, the name for the entire eastern landmass that the older cartographic tradition had called Tartaria. The small name ate the large one, the subdivision swallowed the whole, and the mechanism by which this happened, the administrative or political or military process that produced this terminological transformation, is not something that the standard history of Russian expansion into the East can fully account for. What that history offers is the following. The Cossack expeditions of the 16th and 17th centuries, the fur trade, the gradual extension of Russian administrative control eastward across the Urals, the establishment of fortified outposts along the river systems, the eventual reach to the Pacific. It is a history of exploration and conquest, of a European power moving into territory it did not previously control and establishing dominion over it. The history is detailed. It has names and dates and routes and records of the conflicts with the peoples the Cossacks encountered. It is, by the standards of the period, a well-documented history. But it is a history of conquest that does not account for what was being conquered. The peoples encountered in the official record of the Russian eastward expansion are described as tribal, nomadic, pre-political. They are described in the language that European colonial documentation always used for peoples it categorized as lacking the organizational sophistication that would have required different treatment. They are described as manageable, and this description is difficult to reconcile with what the maps from the century before that expansion showed in the same territory. Because the maps did not show tribal nomads, the maps showed a bureaucratic civilization. They showed administrative divisions. They showed cities with names and internal hierarchies. They showed a place organized the way a place is organized when it has been organized for a very long time by people who understood administration. There is a specific category of evidence that sits between the maps and the official record of Russian expansion, and that category is architectural. Siberia contains structures that the official chronology of the region cannot satisfactorily place. There are cities in Siberia, Tobolsk, Tomsk, Omsk, Irkutsk, whose oldest surviving buildings exhibit a material vocabulary and a structural sophistication that the official founding dates of those cities, all of them established as Cossack forts in the 17th century, do not accommodate. The problem is not that the buildings are impressive. The problem is that the methods required to produce them were not available to the Cossack expeditionary forces that the historical record places at those locations at those times. The stone cutting, the load distribution, the systematic approach to civic space. These are not the products of a fort-building military culture operating at the eastern edge of its supply chain. They are the products of an established urban tradition, a tradition with time behind it and institutions behind it, and a accumulated practical knowledge of how to build cities that works. The official explanation is renovation. The official explanation is almost always renovation. The Cossacks built the fort, and then the fort became a town, and then the town became a city, and somewhere in that sequence the buildings were improved upon, upgraded. The earlier crude structures replaced by the more sophisticated ones we see today. The renovation is the mechanism that bridges every gap between what the timeline says should be there and what is actually there. And the renovation, as is consistent across every instance of its invocation in the history of Siberian urbanism, left no documentary trace. No records of the building work, no accounts of who did it or where the materials came from or how the technical knowledge required was obtained or transmitted. The renovation is present only as a necessity. It exists because something has to have happened, and this is the something that allows the official sequence to hold. Tobolsk is the clearest case. Tobolsk was established, according to the official record, in 1587. It became the administrative capital of Siberia, and in that capacity it is the city through which the Russian imperial management of the entire Eastern Territory was organized for the better part of 3 centuries. Its stone Kremlin, its cathedral, its network of civic structures represent the most complete surviving example of pre-modern urban organization east of the Urals, and the technical analysis of those structures, the material composition, the construction geometry, the integration of heating and drainage systems, places their actual construction in a period that begins before 1587 and extends into a timeline that the official founding date cannot accommodate. This is not a fringe finding. This is what you encounter when you read the technical literature on Siberian architectural history rather than the popular histories that repeat the founding dates without examining the structures those dates are supposed to explain. The renaming question and the architectural question converge at a specific point. If the territory that became Siberia had been, in the period before Russian expansion, something other than what the official history describes, something organized, something administrative, something that produced cities and maintained them, then the process of renaming that territory was not merely a terminological shift. It was the first step in a very specific kind of historical management. The kind of management that begins with the name, because the name is the most accessible thing. The name is what ordinary people use. The name is what appears in the letters and the ledgers and the spoken directions and the mental maps that people carry around and use to navigate their world. Change the name, and you have already changed the thing for most practical purposes. The physical evidence can be addressed separately, building by building, through the retrofit explanation and the renovation explanation, and the explanation that the impressive structure was actually built later than it looks, or built by craftsmen imported from elsewhere, or built under circumstances that the documentary record, unfortunately, does not preserve. But the name goes first, and in this case, the name went in a specific direction. It went from a name that indexed a civilization to a name that indexed a condition. Tartaria named a place where people were organized and had been organized. Siberia named a geographic feature, the sleeping land, the cold region, the far territory. It named what the land was like to be in rather than what had been done with it. This is a meaningful shift in naming logic, and it is not the kind of shift that happens naturally. When people name places, they name them after what is significant about those places. And for a region that had been, on the best available cartographic evidence, the site of an elaborate civilization, the significant thing would have been the civilization. The cold would not have been significant enough to produce a name. The cold was already present when the civilization was being mapped. The cold did not prevent the cities from being built. The cold did not prevent the administrative hierarchies from functioning. The cold was simply the climate. And you do not name a continent after its climate unless you are trying to replace the name it had before with something that points at nothing consequential. The cartographic transition is documented enough to establish a specific window. Between approximately 1670 and 1730, in the maps produced by the major European cartographic centers, the terminology shifts. Before that window, Tartaria. After it, Siberia and its associated regional designations. During the window itself, both names appear, sometimes on the same map, sometimes with visible uncertainty about where one ends and the other begins. This is the overlap period, the argument period that normally characterizes how names transition. What is unusual is how quickly the argument ends. Normally, the contested terminology persists for generations. Cartographers are conservative. They repeat what their predecessors used until the evidence of change becomes overwhelming. The shift from Tartaria to the new naming system resolves, on the cartographic record, with a speed that is inconsistent with the gradual, evidence-driven conservatism of the cartographic tradition. Something settled the argument quickly. Something produced, within a relatively short period, a consensus that the old name was no longer appropriate and the new one was. That kind of rapid consensus has a cause. Consensuses of that speed in naming traditions are not produced by the organic evolution of usage. They are produced by decisions. The Russian Imperial Archive contains a substantial body of documentation about the administration of Siberia beginning in the late 17th century. It contains census records, tax records, trade records, military correspondence, and administrative instructions from the central government to its regional representatives. What it contains in notably smaller quantity is documentation of the period before those administrative structures were established. The records of what was in the region before the Russian administrative apparatus arrived are sparse in a way that is disproportionate to the scale and significance of the territory. Administrative cultures generate documents. A civilization of the size and complexity that the pre-transition maps indicate would have generated an enormous quantity of documents. The question of where those documents are, where the administrative record of the entity that the European cartographers spent 2 centuries mapping as Tartaria actually resides, is not a question that the official archival history of the region has a clean answer to. Some of that record may have been destroyed. Some of it may have been absorbed into the Russian administrative archive and relabeled, recategorized, stripped of its original context, and filed under headings that describe it as something other than what it was. Some of it may be in the libraries of institutions that hold it, without fully understanding what it is, waiting for the kind of cross-referential scholarship that would connect it to the maps that give it context. And some of it may be in the category of things that were managed out of the accessible record through a process that was never documented, precisely because the documentation of the process would itself have been a record of what the process was removing. The sleeping land. That is what the name offers. A vast territory east of everything, cold and dormant, waiting to be organized by the civilization that arrived to find it empty. That is the narrative that the name supports. That is the work the name does. It makes the territory available. It makes it an absence waiting to be filled rather than a presence that was displaced. And when you look at the maps that preceded the name, the maps that the most authoritative cartographic institutions of the 16th and 17th centuries produced with the care and methodological rigor they applied to every other significant territory they documented, you are looking at evidence that the absence was constructed, that the emptiness was the second condition, that the sleeping land was, not so long ago, awake. Someone decided it should sleep, and they started, as you always start with this kind of decision, with the name. Because once the name is gone, the thing the name pointed to has to work very hard to remain visible. It has to survive in the physical record, in the architectural record, in the material texture of the cities it built, and the trade routes it organized, and the administrative logic it imposed on the space it occupied. And those things can be explained. Building by building, road by road. They can be renovated, in the official account, into something that fits. The cold takes care of the rest. The cold and the distance and the sheer scale of the forgetting required, which is, when you consider the size of the territory involved, almost the largest forgetting in recorded history. Almost, except for the fact that the maps still exist. And the maps, for anyone willing to sit with what they are actually showing, are not ambiguous. Tartaria was not a legend. Siberia was not empty. And the distance between those two facts is the distance the name traveled. A very long way in a very short time, leaving very little trace of the journey. That is not geography. That is administration. And administration of that thoroughness, applied to a territory of that size, with that consistency, in that specific historical window, does not happen because a committee of cartographers independently decided that the old name was no longer serving its purpose. It happens because someone needed the land to have always been sleeping, and made sure, with considerable care, that the maps would eventually agree.